Have you ever been waiting for a train, a tram, or especially a bus, and then 2 or 3 come? Great, I had to wait for 20 minutes, but now I have 2 buses. All is well in the world. This is bunching. One of the biggest struggles in public transport operations is actually preventing this, or at least it should be. Far too often, public transportation systems accept bunching as a given and don't do nearly enough to address it. This is bad because obviously it means less frequent service in practice, and frequency is great for public transit, but also because bunching is so visible to the average person waiting for their bus on the street corner. Bunched up vehicles might as well be a giant sign that says, "Our city has bad public transit." So let's look at bunching, what causes it, and what cities can do to fight back. Welcome back to RM Transit, a channel about the dynamics of public transport operations. To support my work and get early access, consider joining my Patreon community or watching on Nebula. The simplest cause of bus bunching is really just the randomness or chaos of the universe. It might surprise you, but buses are not a natural phenomenon. They don't grow in great fields, and they don't naturally run on time. Something as simple as a bus running just a little bit late can start the bunching snowball down the hill. I'm going to use buses a lot for examples in this video, and that's not because bunching is exclusive to them, they just tend to be a big culprit for it. A bus can be made late in 100 different ways. Someone holds the door, a car cuts it off, or the operator is moving a bit too slowly. It's easy for it to happen. Once a vehicle's late, almost as if by gravity, bunching begins. As a vehicle falls a little behind schedule, more and more people show up at each stop. And that means the vehicle spends more and more time at each subsequent stop and falls even further behind. A busier vehicle is also going to have to stop more frequently to let people off, which could potentially slow it down even more. At the same time, the vehicle directly behind the late vehicle, since it's arriving at stops which have just been served by that late vehicle, is picking up less and less people, and that means it's going faster and faster. This, along with the leading vehicle running slower and slower, means bunching, and once they're bunched together, they really need to be unstuck by force. So it kind of makes sense why bunching occurs once the process gets set in motion, but what exacerbates it? Well, there's a lot of things. One, I think, is frequency. When you run a more frequent service, the gap between vehicles gets smaller, so falling even a little behind means getting close to the next vehicle quite quickly. And when your vehicles are close together, you have less room to try to accelerate and get back onto schedule. It really is a lot like gravity, since as the vehicles get closer together, the effect is heightened more and more. Tightly spaced stops are also a big bunching promoter for surface routes, for a lot of the same reasons as tight headways, that is, high frequency. When there's less distance between stops, there's just less room to get up to speed and try to catch back up with the schedule. The more I think about it, there's also more room for randomness, which doesn't help with bunching or staying on schedule. Assuming you have a similar number of riders, but twice as many stops, the distribution of riders is going to be far less consistent. Some days one rider might decide to go to one stop, and some days another. And it's not always the case that every stop will cause the vehicle to slow down the same amount. Some days you'll skip a lot of stops, and some days you'll have to make a lot of stops. Sometimes you'll have to stop for just one person. A process which in and of itself invites more chaos, as I talked about in a previous video. Your drivers may also just not follow the schedule. Sometimes they might let things run a little slow, such as waiting for a straggler instead of making them wait for the next bus, which seems nice, but if it creates a bunching scenario for all of the riders on a line, it's probably worse overall. There are also drivers who might get a bit ahead of themselves, going too fast and not willing to pause on the route, and that creates the same effect of catching up that I mentioned earlier. There are also just operators who don't care about the schedule at all and do whatever they want, which are a bigger problem. Of course, it doesn't just come down to drivers and the service. If traffic signals aren't designed to prioritize transit, they can exacerbate bunching by hitting transit with a bunch of red lights that throws it off schedule. The waves of traffic you so often see in car-oriented cities also often make it so that vehicles bunch together in the same wave. And as with stops and service, more traffic signals, which are common in North America of course, also exacerbate bunching by throwing more chaos into the system, transit priority or not. And I think this theme of randomness leading to bunching is a big part of why bunching tends to be worse with buses than with trams, and worse with trams than with metro systems. With metro systems, as complex as they are, there just aren't nearly as many factors that can lead to delays as with buses. You don't have cross-traffic or request stops, and at least with trams, you don't have to pull into and out of traffic to make the stops. And because trams and metro networks are virtually always operating with less vehicles and more network importance because they are rail modes, they tend to get more attention and be easier to manage for system operations than bus routes. In fact, many metro systems are even automated to a degree, so drivers don't necessarily need to give all that much input to keep things on schedule. And automated train systems are often even designed with catch-up modes, where trains can operate faster than usual to get back onto schedule and prevent bunching. But while metros are great, I truly do love metros, if you watch the channel you'll know that, how can we make bunching less of a problem on those trickier surface transit options? I've broken the options into two categories. The painful measures, which like many blunt instruments are pretty effective at their intended purpose, but are blunt instruments, and the less painful measures, which require more finesse. The most painful of bunching solutions is the short turn, where you pull a vehicle out of service going in one direction, likely the lead vehicle of a bunch, and try to send it back in the other direction to fill a gap in service. This isn't too terrible for passengers, since when you have a bunch of vehicles, well, the first one disappearing just means passengers have to get off and get on to the next one, which should be coming shortly behind it. But it does mean you have to change vehicles and you probably lose your seats, so it's irritating. The reality is too that if you're doing a short turn, your system already has a lot of chaos in it because it also has a gap in service going in the other direction. Short turns are quite relevant when you're doing a headway-based versus schedule-based route management, so I'm going to talk about that more in a future video. Make sure to subscribe for that. Probably a better option, which can work particularly well when you have too many stops, is having a late vehicle bypass stops where people aren't requesting to get off. Since we're assuming that you're a decent transit system that runs a fairly frequent service, and bunching means the other vehicle is just behind you, skipping some stops means that those passengers don't necessarily have to wait all that long. And it's really good at making sure a late vehicle actually gets back on time by kind of running semi-express. Of course though, having vehicles bypass people is a good way of making those people angry, and so you have to really consider this solution and how bad the bunching is. Fortunately, there are less painful options, but nothing is free in this world, and so they do require more infrastructure, foresight, and active management. One obvious and popular solution are transit priority signals. These can actually be as simple as transit signals which are timed so that the green wave, so to speak, is aligned with the average travel speed of transit vehicles, so buses and trams tend to get more green lights. Probably what's more interesting, and what people usually think about when they think about transit signal priority, is active priority. This is where potentially you have a green light extended so that a tram or bus can get through an intersection if it's running a bit behind, or truncating a red light so that vehicles can get moving more quickly. This is of course harder to implement when you have a lot of traffic signals, in a similar way to having nicer transit stops when you have too many of them, like I talked about in my recent Berlin and Toronto trams video. Active transit signal priority is also more challenging when you have wide roads and single stage crossings. You can learn more about different types of crossings in this video by Ontario Traffic Map. The long and short of it is that the pedestrian signal time is often the limiting factor for the signal cycle at a given intersection, because pedestrians take longer to cross an intersection and clear it. Narrower streets means pedestrians cross the street more quickly, so you have more room to mess with the signal timings to prioritize transit vehicles, and multi-stage crossings give you a bit more flexibility and granularity, so that once a pedestrian has passed the first half of a road, a transit vehicle can be given priority even if the pedestrian is still crossing the second half. The stops in service on a route can also be modified. If you operate larger vehicles, that is double-decker, articulated, or even bi-articulated buses, or longer trams, you can potentially scale back frequency a bit. This isn't me suggesting that you do the terrible practice of running a low frequency with a big vehicle, but just getting frequency a little bit lower by using bigger vehicles. So instead of having a bus come every couple of minutes, you have one come every 10, but with an articulated unit. Removing stops will also help for the obvious reasons. When there are less stops, there's less randomness in the pattern with which passengers are distributed and with the pattern of where buses actually need to stop. This makes running times more consistent, which is good for preventing bunching, but it also gives you more room for a late vehicle to catch up. Probably the most important solution for managing bunching is active management. That looks like line operators who control several lines, telling the slow operators to speed up, the fast operators to slow down, and trying little interventions to try to unstuck bunched up buses and trams. There are actually a lot of digital systems employed by transit operators that tell drivers if they're early or late, but these digital systems are just never going to be as effective as someone getting on the radio and saying, "Please, slow down." Of course, planners and schedulers also need to close the loop by being familiar with routes and the potential congestion and delay points, and also talking to operators so they can tell them directly where bunching tends to happen. But you also do have to be realistic. Active management can be great, but it's resource intensive, and you need to focus those resources in the most effective way. So planners have to manage creating routes that require less tinkering, but also managing resources. At the end of the day, bunch transit is usually bad transit. By focusing on providing riders with a quick and consistent experience, we can convince people to get on transit and use resources more effectively. Thanks for watching.